North Korea. It always seems to make some crazy headlines, but it's been even crazier than usual lately, or seemingly so. Last week, they tested yet another ballistic missile. There's been talk of potentially another nuclear bomb test happening any day now. And it's kind of shaping up to be one of the biggest foreign policy problems for the Trump administration. I'm here today at the Vice News headquarters in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, with Ankit Panda, a senior editor at The Diplomat, and Dave Schmerler, a research associate at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, who's joining us from Monterey, California. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on with North Korea's missiles and their weapons program, and Trump's options for dealing with this situation diplomatically. The first question is for you, Ankit. It seems like we're hearing about this a lot now, but North Korea and the U.S. have been rattling sabers at each other for years now. Is what's happening lately different somehow, more intense, or is this just because Trump is tweeting about it that we're hearing about it more?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a little column A, a little column B, right? So North Korean missile testing has certainly ramped up in intensity. We saw 24 of those in 2016, 24 projectiles tested out of North Korea, and 2 nuclear tests, a satellite launch. So really, I think that drew a lot of attention to the problem already, but then Trump takes over at a point where the North Koreans have already shown us this great momentum in their testing. And then, the administration comes into office, they carry out a policy review. They basically go back to the drawing board on North Korea policy. And they haven't really come back with anything different. But, you've seen leaks from the administration statements, repeatedly emphasizing that all options are on the table, hinting at potential preemption. And I think that's been, that's led to some headlines that have kind of spooked people, especially during the policy review, when really, you want everything to be on the table. So an administration saying that they're considering a military option isn't unusual in the context of a policy review necessarily, but, the kind of headlines that leads to, I think, definitely gets people a little worried. So, yeah, the North Koreans have definitely shown us that they are making real progress with their system. So that merits real concern. But the Trump administration's messaging has also been a part of getting people worried here.
Yeah, the Trump wild card makes everything a little more complicated. He's talked a lot about not wanting them to launch missiles and trying to pressure China into stopping them from doing another nuclear bomb test. Dave, they had another missile test last week. It was called a failure in the media. What do we know about that test? Was it really a failure, and what does it mean?
Well, I think that the assessments that were saying that it was a KN-17, the conversation on that missile started sometime before, slightly after North Korea's military parade. It's supposedly a liquid fuel Scud-based missile system with terminal guidance fins that was originally, or at least released in some press format, a anti-ship missile. But as we were talking earlier before this, it seems like the North Koreans don't have the technology to accurately target ships with a warhead like that. So it could also be just for more highly accurate liquid fuel systems in the short to medium fuel range. But yeah, and that's kind of where we're at right now.
When these tests are described as a failure in the media, does that mean that it was a failure for North Korea, or are they learning something even when it goes wrong?
Sorry for not answering that earlier. Failure is something that makes us feel safe at night. When North Korea sends something up into the air and it fails, it's reassuring to us, but that entirely depends on what the North Koreans set out to achieve when they test, and that's something that we don't know. If we have evidence of a missile blowing up on a launch pad, then yes, that is clearly a failure, like we saw over in Wonsan like a month ago or so. But something that took off into the air and then exploded is a bit harder to assess. Plus, you can always learn from failures. That's rocket science. Every country's ballistic missile program has tons of failures that you don't hear about because, those aren't things that really make the headline unless you're North Korea. So, if it was a failure, sure, great, but it doesn't really take away the important fact that North Korea is developing a more advanced and complicated ballistic missile program.
Yeah, turns out rocket science is really hard, and that's why they call it rocket science.
Right.
The other component of the weapons program is North Korea's development of nuclear bombs. There's been a lot of talk recently, some experts who studied the testing site saying that a test could happen any day, that it's imminent. We haven't seen that yet. We've also seen reports of guys playing volleyball at the test site. I don't know if
Right.
If they're just huge fans of Top Gun and not getting on the nuke test. So I'm curious to hear what you guys think about why there hasn't been a test yet, and what's the significance if one does happen. What are the potential diplomatic fallout of something like that happening?
Sure. I mean, so the first thing to say is that, the North Koreans know that this is one of the most highly watched pieces of real estate through satellite imagery on Earth. And they know that we're looking to see what they're doing. And, this volleyball thing, maybe they just like volleyball. Maybe they're not just messing with us by playing a game of volleyball. That's good for them, I guess. But really, the nuclear test question has kind of turned into this will they, won't they kind of drama. Just, like over the past few weeks, I know every night on Twitter, you'll see people kind of being like, is this the night? Kim Il-sung's birthday's coming up. Are they going to test? The founding of the workers of the Korean People's Army is coming up. Are they going to test? And there's all this kind of back and forth that goes on. I think the North Koreans realize that they have a bit of leverage here. As long as they don't test, they can sort of still string along the Trump administration, get them to still release more statements, give them more data points about what the United States is willing to do in a potential negotiation. Rex Tillerson made some comments yesterday that I think are, again, suggestive that the United States is pretty much going to stick to what the Obama administration, called strategic patience, basically that old policy. I think they realize that, as long as they don't test this nuke, they're kind of getting more information about what the United States will do. The minute they do test it, though, I think, that will sort of force the hand of both China, the Trump administration. We'll probably see a new round of UN sanctions. So they clearly know, what the costs and benefits are here.
Dave, what are they going to learn from another nuclear test, and does that put them closer to developing something that could be potentially put on a missile and used against either countries that are close to them or the big fear for folks here, a missile that could reach the U.S. with a nuclear warhead attached to it?
So I'm not sure if this is completely or entirely accepted in the field, but I think there are enough strong opinions now to say that they probably have a device that is compact enough to fit on a missile. That's no longer the question. The question is, do they have a missile that has the range to reach the United States? And that's something that the American public and whatnot are more interested in. So have they gotten to the point where they can put something on the end of a missile? They're probably there. From the information we've been able to pull, at least on a limited basis from the disco ball device when Kim Jong-un was standing in front of the bomb with all the KN-08s in the back. But yeah, I don't know. What can they learn from a new nuclear test? It depends, again, on what their test parameters are, what they're going to test, the size, the yield. It's entirely in their hands. But on the note of when they'll test, I think we talked about it, or you guys established that point. But, I mean, they can test whenever they want to. A nuclear test is something that I think they might have a bit more reliability with than a new missile system. So they're going to test on their own time schedule. So.
We're also taking questions from our audience. You can put it in the comments on Facebook or on YouTube or add us on Twitter. And we have our first question from Amit on YouTube. Is China fully responsible for North Korea's power, and how much of a role does China play? And this question is especially relevant today because just yesterday, North Korean state media published an article that really criticized China, which is kind of unusual, and kind of blamed them for escalating tensions and contributing to the situation. Ankit, what do you make of that recent comment from North Korea, and how is Trump right when he says that China has the power to kind of influence and control North Korea?
Sure. I mean, so, I'll begin with the Trump point, because, one of my frustrations with how the North Korea issue is talked about kind of in the U.S. political spheres, whenever a politician, we saw this at, GOP and the Democratic presidential debates in 2016, whenever North Korea came up, the kind of go-to answer for any candidate was, get China to do more. There was this kind of perception that, if only China did more, magically, everything would be okay with North Korea. And that could really, not be further from the truth. I mean, China does not hold the secret key to just, switching North Korea's program on and off, either ballistic missiles or nuclear, right? They have a degree of economic clout. They could be doing a better job on implementing sanctions, helping the United States and the United Nations apply more pressure on North Korea. But again, we've seen how successful pressure's been. So, and to talk a bit about where things stand between the two countries, I mean, so really things have been on a downhill slide since December 2013 when Jang Song-taek, Kim Jong-un's uncle, who under Kim Jong-il was kind of the go-between between Beijing and Pyongyang, was executed. And since then, we've seen multiple signs that the relationship is not doing great. There was this, volley of kind of op-eds coming out of North Korean state media after the Global Times, a nationalistic newspaper in China that doesn't speak for the Chinese government, but expresses a range of more nationalistic opinions, has been saying that, North Korea shouldn't cross certain red lines and test China's commitment to its own security. So really, this relationship is not doing great. And, they have this 1961 treaty that sometimes comes up in discussions of a military incident on the Korean Peninsula, where Article 2 of that treaty actually commits China to come to the assistance of North Korea in a conflict. But the Chinese, we think, have communicated to the North Koreans in the early 2010s that if the North Koreans are the ones to start a conflict, especially a nuclear conflict, then that article just would not apply, and China probably wouldn't come into a conflict. But there are some ambiguities, and that did come up in the state media article that we saw yesterday.
So we have another reader question from Steve Torres on YouTube. He mentions that people don't talk about the anti-ballistic missile systems that the U.S. has, and the U.S. has kind of claimed that they could potentially shoot down a missile from North Korea if they wanted to or had to. I'm sure Dave has some thoughts about this, but we want to bring the THAAD anti-missile system that the U.S. now has in South Korea and is now, they say, operational into this discussion. So I'm going to ask this to Dave. Dave, if North Korea shot a missile, could the U.S. shoot it down if they wanted
to? Maybe. Yeah. I mean, maybe they could. That's what the system's designed for. But when North Korea launches a missile at whatever, South Korea, let's say, the place where THAAD is supposed to be protecting, they're going to be launching multiple missiles from multiple locations. And I think the question isn't whether or not THAAD can hit a missile. It's whether or not THAAD can adapt and protect its designated area from salvo launches from all across North Korea, and that's still, we're not sure.
Right, and one of the important things about THAAD that sometimes I think gets lost is that it can't do anything against an ICBM, and it's never been tested against an intermediate range missile, the Musudan, which is the one that could theoretically maybe hit Guam. So
Right.
THAAD can't do anything against those systems. Those would be dealt with by the ground-based interceptors in Alaska. And then the success rate of that system is not at a place where I would feel confident saying that, this is a sure thing. It's far from a sure thing.
So basically the U.S. wants the world to think that they could shoot down a missile, but where they're really nervous about having to actually prove that.
Well, I mean, in a way, there's been all these, hundreds of billions of dollars have gone into this program, began in the 80s, and there is, a degree of uncertainty. I mean, what happens if you try to intercept? I mean, this is why, sometimes people make this proposal that if North Korea tests an ICBM, we should try to shoot it down, just to, send a message of resolve that we're so strong and powerful. What happens if you miss? How does that kind of change American perceptions of how secure the country feels from ballistic missile threats from China and Russia more broadly? And not only that, I mean, in a realistic situation, if you shoot one of these ground-based interceptors, which are massive rockets, they're huge. If they miss, they're going to be flying into China, potentially Russia. I mean, there's all these potential rooms for things to go wrong. Missile defense, again, like China not being the solution to everything. With North Korea, again, missile defense isn't going to just kind of put a glass dome over the United States to just kind of shield us from this threat.
So this THAAD system is in kind of central South Korea, south of Seoul, and Seoul is pretty close to the North Korean border. So they're the ones who are most worried about some sort of conflict where North Korea is launching missiles because they're the closest target, they're the prime target. So THAAD is, in theory, designed to help South Korea more than the United States.
Actually, there was this huge conversation this weekend when Trump said on his interview on Friday that South Korea should pay for THAAD. So, he seems to be under the impression that THAAD is primarily for the benefit of the South Korean people, that the United States is being generous and kind of bearing the costs for the deployment. I actually don't think that's true. I mean, if you look at the location of the system, it's actually there primarily to protect U.S. assets that are based in the southern part of the Korean Peninsula, Busan, which I think Dave's done some great work on, looking at North Korean maps that they leave out in pictures where they actually show missile trajectories going to Busan. The North Koreans are thinking about fighting a nuclear war. And the way they're thinking about this is, Dave brought up some of it, which is they're going to use these salvo missile launches to try to overwhelm THAAD and kind of try to hit command and control nodes the United States and South Korea have. But they're really looking to, undertake a first strike against kind of military assets that the United States and South Korea have, potentially the Strategic Bomber Force in Guam. They really worry about the strategic bombers. They really hate it when the United States flies one of those B-1Bs or B-2s near the DMZ. That is what they're thinking about. The problem with Seoul tends to more be the conventional artillery, the multiple launch rocket systems that they have that could do significant damage, but they're not really looking to kind of start a conflict by immediately kind of nuking Seoul.
Right. And China has been kind of pissed off about that as well, in part because they think it's going to be used to monitor Chinese military activities. And I think recently, or a while back, the former NSA director was giving a public interview, and he let slip that this radar system stretches all the way into Manchuria, which nobody had known before, and kind of explains why the U.S. would want it there and why China would be, why are you putting this in our backyard?
Yeah, that was Michael Hayden, former CIA director, who, he tends to do that from time to time, I think. But yeah, the thing with this radar, it's called the AN-TIPY-2 system. It's a pretty powerful radar system. The range is actually classified, but we have a pretty good idea of how far it goes. And there's two modes that the radar can sit in when it's in the Korean Peninsula. One's called terminal mode, which is what the THAAD system would need it to be in. It would need to be in that mode to actually intercept missiles, right? Or it can be in forward basing mode, which extends the range. And switching between those two modes doesn't take too long. I think the numbers I've seen, it's like a few hours. But the reason the Chinese worry, they've actually said, the foreign minister has explicitly said that we worry about this powerful X-band radar. We don't think you need this radar. We think it's too much for the Korean Peninsula. Use a less great radar and things will be fine. I think the bigger concern from the Chinese is that they're worried that this radar could actually peer at their nuclear weapons. When, in a nuclear contingency, if China's going to be shooting ICBMs anywhere, they're going to want, they're not going to want the United States to be able to differentiate between decoys and real warheads, potentially increasing the odds of missile defense. So there's all this kind of, strategic stability stuff that you could go into, but the Chinese are really just not happy about the system. And they've gone to the extent of really kind of demolishing their relationship with South Korea, which used to be quite good. In 2015, former President Park Geun-hye went to, the military parade in Beijing celebrating the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Things were really on an upswing. And now if you look at, public opinion in South Korea of China, it's just the pits. They've taken a hit.
So we've been talking a little bit about China launching missiles, North Korea launching missiles, the U.S. shooting missiles down. It's a nice segue to another reader question from Chris Marone on Facebook. And he asks, there's been all these people are saying go to war, it will be easy. Afghanistan and Iraq didn't have any militaries, and we're stuck there. How would North Korea be any easier? Certainly, I have my own views that a war with North Korea would not be easy and would be really bad for all people involved. But curious, how bad you guys think it would be, and what the immediate fallout, and I think Dave can talk about for South Korea and U.S. military bases in Japan and Guam. What could North Korea do if we were to retaliate, if we were to do some sort of military action against them?
South Korea is all on the target list, and that's something they've been able to hit for quite some time. They can hit all of South Korea with Nodongs and Scuds and everything down below, even down to conventional artillery and rocket artillery units. So anything on the peninsula is fair game for the North Koreans. Japan is certainly there. They can hit bases in southern Japan with Nodongs and ER Scuds. So pretty much all of the American assets in that theater are certainly capable of being hit. Guam is a bit of a stretch. The Musudan is designed for Guam, but whether or not it can actually reach Guam is a whole other question. They added on some modifications to the Russian system, the R-27 that the Musudan is based off of, that significantly pulls the range, even though it's slightly larger. But it wouldn't be short or sweet or pretty at all. And any conflict on the peninsula would be a disaster. Like anyone who thinks otherwise is delusional.
And Ankit, there's certainly been some sort of war drums beating. There's been tough talk from Rex Tillerson, from Trump, from Mike Pence. Basically, all the top American diplomats and leaders have hinted that we're not going to rule out the possibility of some sort of armed conflict with North Korea. How likely is that really? Are they just talking tough to try to intimidate North Korea? Or are we actually closer to some sort of actual war than we have been in years past?
Okay, look, I mean, I think the first place to start with is the fact that, South Korea is an ally, and they've been going through a period of political turmoil. They're actually about to just elect in a new president. Looks like it's going to be Moon Jae-in, who is a liberal, wants to take a different approach to North Korea, to say the least, than the previous government. So, when the United States has been talking about a conflict on the Korean Peninsula, I mean, first of all, I think it's irresponsible to be sending these kinds of signals when the South Koreans really have no sort of legitimate political leadership. They have a caretaker president that could, never really make a legitimate democratic authorization of conflict with a mandate from the people really ever become a possibility, right? So that, I think, ruled out the possibility of conflict, for me at least, happening earlier on this year, because basically everything that the United States knows about war fighting on the Korean Peninsula is in conjunction with South Korean forces. This is why they're doing these exercises every spring, right? Key resolve, full legal. The North Koreans, again, really hate these exercises. But basically, I mean, not only, Dave's absolutely right that a war on the Korean Peninsula would be devastating without a doubt, but the United States would be crazy to initiate it without complete buy-in from the South Koreans. So that's just the first part of it. But, to go back to just this administration's messaging, it really has been all over the place. I think I'm at the point now where I feel fairly confident that they're basically sticking with strategic patience. Like, if you really put all of these people in a room and you said, what's your North Korea policy, they would eventually come clean that we're basically doing what the Obama administration did. We're just going to talk about it a little bit differently. I don't think, they're going to be serious about this. But again, I mean, look, with the kinds of interviews that we've seen the president do, there is a real chance for him to say something that could affect the North Koreans' calculus. I mean, we don't know how they think of Trump, right? I mean, we all understand that Trump is a very different kind of president. He doesn't have previous elected government experience or public office experience, so he doesn't know how to carry himself when it comes to strategic communication. When you're thinking about things like deterrence on the Korean Peninsula, you really care about what the American president is going to say, right? So when he tweets out in January that the ICBM is not going to happen, there's good evidence that the North Koreans have interpreted that as sort of a serious red line. And they've been pacing their ICBM program to kind of build up to that and see what they can get out of Trump in the meantime. So yeah, I mean, what the government says really matters, but I don't think that they're immediately serious about the possibility of conflict.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you look at something like what happened with the aircraft carrier, where we say, oh, we're sending an aircraft, an armada, as Trump said, and it'll just take a few weeks to get there. And I think that is a kind of a telling sign of how serious they are about this and how much of it is just a little bit of bluster and intimidation versus, actually being closer to the brink of war. Although, as you mentioned, the possibility of accidentally bumbling or stumbling into a war is certainly terrifying and not outside the realm of possibility. Another question from our audience on Facebook, Diego on Facebook asks, can North Korea deliver a nuclear device without a missile launch? That's one for you, Dave. Is there any way for them to deploy a nuclear weapon without strapping it to the top of a missile?
Sure. I mean, yeah, at the end of the day, it's a bomb. So as long as you have a way to set it off, you could, you be creative. I mean, whether or not the plans to employ a system like that are realistic or reliable, I can't tell you. But I mean, yeah, maybe they could throw it on a sub and try to run it up the Han River. Like, I don't know. Sure, yeah, they could do a bunch of different things. It's something the North Koreans have shown interest in. No, I mean, it seems like they're sticking with the ballistic missile path. I haven't read too much into the North Koreans delivering it by bomber, but yeah. I mean, they could hypothetically deliver it a whole bunch of ways.
I mean, bomber seems like we could shoot that down relatively easily compared to a missile.
Yeah, I'm not saying that they would. I'm just saying, like, can you do something versus are they going to do something, right? So North Koreans are planning on delivering their nuclear weapons at the end of a missile. That's what they want to do. Can they do other things? Sure. Are they reliable or realistic for them? No, probably not.
Do we think that that is the biggest concern, is the possibility of them, obviously the prospect of launching a nuclear warhead on a missile is the most terrifying and kind of the doomsday scenario, but should that really be what we're worried about most, or is there some lower level threat that we're not talking about that's more likely to happen and trigger some sort of war on the Korean Peninsula? And either of you guys can take that.
I think that's a good question. I mean, certainly, I think it's worth kind of mentally differentiating between their shorter and medium range systems and their ICBMs, right? Which I think sometimes doesn't happen, especially in the United States. And it's understandable, right? Because if you're living in LA, New York, you're worried about the North Korean missiles that can potentially hit you one day, right? But the shorter range systems, they know they work. They've been working with these Scuds for, since the 80s, really. They're well tested. They know they work. Now they're at the point where they're trying to work on terminal maneuverability with the Scuds and Scud-based missiles. So really, the developments that we're seeing now from North Korea are really about making preemption impossible for South Korea and the United States. And they're doing that in a bunch of ways. They've kind of looked at these new armored vehicles with missiles called transporter erector launchers that we've seen with kind of tracked wheels where they can kind of take them off-road or go off on paved roads and really just put them in a bunch of places where they wouldn't have been able to do that before. Again, which makes just finding these difficult, right? Because you're going to be playing this game if you're the United States and South Korea, where you're going to be trying to find every missile that can reach your forces to take them out before they can use them. And the North Koreans are just trying to make that much, much more difficult. And they've been, looking at solid fuel, which also makes the missiles just ready to go on kind of the drop of a hat. And create this huge satellite signature where you're fueling your rockets, suggesting to your opponent that you're about to use them, so they can just kind of come in and take care of them before you do that. So there are, those developments that I think are occurring below the ICBM threshold, and they're happening now. They're happening today. And if you talk to the Japanese government, the South Korean government, I mean, this is kind of what they'll tell you really worries them about. Japan just started doing ballistic missile evacuation drills for the first time. I mean, if you're living in Japan, the sense that you have is more, what you might have had in the United States during the Cold War, where, people were doing drills underneath their desks in school during the wars, kind of preparing for a nuclear strike. So this is really, way more real of a threat for these countries than it is out here. And North Koreans are just, they're very comfortable with many of these systems, and they're basically ready to go.
So the last question, and this is one that I get as someone who covers North Korea on a regular basis, from folks in New York, from my family on the West Coast, should we be worried about North Korea attacking the U.S. or some sort of conflict erupting? How, both of you guys, how comfortable do you feel that the situation is not going to spiral out of control in the near future?
I think when we ask that question, should we be worried about North Korea attacking the U.S., it's like a question in the right direction, but it's not the right question. We should be more worried about conflict on the peninsula, because anything on the peninsula is going to affect the United States. It's going to affect Japan. The North Koreans are going to go big, and they're going to try to go first. So anything that even smells like the North Koreans believe they're about to be invaded by the United States is probably going to result in them using their nuclear arsenal. So it's just going to be a disaster all around. I think the question we need to be asking is more, or it should be more focused on conflict in the peninsula instead of it's going to happen over there, but as long as they can't hit the United States, that's fine, because whatever happens over there directly affects the United States. So,
absolutely. I mean, hundreds of thousands of Americans live in the region. There are American troops in the region. Americans will be at risk if there's a war on the Korean Peninsula or a war that affects Japan. The only other thing I'd add on the ICBMs is that, we're getting a pretty good idea of what North Korea's warfighting strategy is, right? So like I said, they look to go nuclear. They look to go first if they sense that the United States and South Korea are gearing up to invade them preemptively, right? Which is why all this talk is dangerous from the government. But the ICBMs aren't going to be a part of that first strike that they do, right? The ICBMs are their theory of how they can end a war and still survive. I don't think it will work for them, because the United States, frankly, I don't think has the capability to really be talked down by a North Korean ICBM threat, unfortunately. I mean, because, that could lead to an incident where, we do kind of see a North Korean ICBM fly towards the United States. But the ICBM is their theory of how they're going to get the United States to stand down and not escalate after they've already kind of taken out a bunch of military assets. And their idea is that they can hopefully hold the U.S. homeland at threat and kind of keep the conflict to a more manageable conventional level. They might be catastrophically wrong about that, but it really seems like that's what they're thinking, and that's kind of what their theory of nuclear warfighting is right now.
I don't know if that's more comforting or not, but that's all the time we have for today. So I want to thank Ankit for coming here to the Vice headquarters in Brooklyn, Dave for joining us from Monterey at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies, and thanks to all of our viewers on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for joining us.